So we are live. Let me today make a very ad hoc video in which I ramble about literature. I'm going to talk about Zola, also Moliere, Flaubert, Balzac, and Maupassant. So it's something of a French theme here. I want to talk about a lot of the books that I've read over the past 2 years. But beyond that, I want to talk about the genre of realism. I want to ask the question, what is the point of the realism genre? I'll give you a positive answer to that, but I will also ask the question, what is the point of realism? What is the point of reading a fucking book if it's just going to tell you about mundane reality? Because ultimately, I think that's a very important question that we have to ask. And personally, I want to give you the perspective today that, most books should not be realistic. Most books should actually be a flight of fancy and should be something creative and should be, to some extent fantastical, whilst at the same time somehow being grounded in reality. I want to talk about this. My thoughts are very inchoate. We're going to touch on some other things. I want to talk a bit. I've been reading a few Greek plays and also Odysseus. I want to give you my thoughts on that, which again might be more, I'm not just going to come on and say, oh my God, they were so great. I'm gonna talk about maybe the problems we have in rendering very, very classic texts, into the modern language. So I want to talk about that as well. There's other things as well, but I think I'll just get on because that will be the best way to do this. So let me tell you about a book which I'm just about to finish now, which is by Émile Zola, and which is called L'Assommoir. I think it's called L'Assommoir. I think that's how I pronounce it. Which is, it's a book about poor people in Paris. Let's just say that. Now, what do I want to say about this book? Because there's so much. And I'm going to let me first of all tell you this. At this point in my life, when I'm 45, I'm not sure I really want to be reading books that much because I kind of feel like I'm in my prime. I'd like to have some power to actually influence reality and change the world on some level. I don't want to be sat in the bath on a Saturday and Sunday morning reading books. But sadly, because I don't have any power to change anything and because I'm a complete nobody and a loser, I've just sort of taken myself away and especially during the winter, I become a hermit. And on a Saturday and Sunday morning, I sit in a hot bath and I read literature. So what I'm trying to say is maybe I'm not in the best mood for literature. And the other thing I want to say is I'm one of those people at age 45. When I was 18, I needed to read literature. I needed it. I needed to read literature to transform my personality. And so I read and 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 I wanted to read everything. And then eventually when I was 25, I thought, okay, I've read enough and now I'm interested in the world. I've read enough that I've changed my character. I've become the person that I truly always felt I was. I've become wise and, and intelligent, and now I don't need to read anymore. And to some extent, that's also my attitude now, age 45. And the reason I tell you all of this is because, when I've read Zola's book, I'm not that interested. So what I'm saying is maybe it's a me problem. Maybe the problem is me. That I don't need to read Zola's L'Assommoir. I mean, yeah. So maybe the problem is me. But here's what I want to say. If I'm going to be very, very negative, I'm going to say, it's been slow. It's been a slog. I've had to read it like 5% at a time almost. But let me say this, which is positive. Oh my God, Zola is brilliant at describing reality. He's brilliant at describing reality. For example, let me give you some good examples from this book. The relationship between the central character Gervais And her two sister-in-laws is brilliant. The two sister-in-laws are just so especially the bitchy one. Well, there's one bitchy one, there's one nice one, but these sister-in-laws and their relation to the central character, brilliantly done. Again, the relationship between Gervais and Virginie, who is the girl, I think she's the girl she has the fight with in the laundrette. This is again brilliant. It's brilliant because they have the fight, but then they patch things up. But actually, secretly, Virginie is still rather bitchy towards Gervais. And it's something which is fundamental to the human condition, which is that oftentimes people create social circles in which they are friends with certain people, but by God, they're not really friends. There's always a level of bitchy, passive aggressiveness in all of these friendships. That is what Zola is so great at portraying. Again, if we look at Lantier, who is the husband of Gervais, or the ex-husband of Gervais, wonderful character. His relationship with Gervais and his relationship with the new husband, Coupeau, or whatever he's called, that's very good. And just in general, Gervais is such a parasite. He's one of these people who, he's one of these people who lives off others. I know some of you will be saying, Thomas, you're a scoundrel. You live off your parents' handouts. Yeah, I know. Okay, but I know how to live in a modest fashion. This Lantier is someone who, he just constantly borrows money, which he never pays back, and he uses it to go to fancy restaurants. But anyway, what am I saying? Zola's portrayal of reality is wonderful. And you need to know this stuff. And this brings us to the question of, why should I read realistic literature? Because what a lot of people will say is what I've kind of hinted at here, which is it's kind of a bit boring because it's all about the mundaneness of life. So what is the point of reading realistic literature? Well, let me tell you this. Why did I first fall in love with Chekhov aged 18? I will tell you why. Because when I was 17, I was very, very, very confused. And the reason I was confused is that reality seemed to me to be very depressing and very awful in very many different ways. And yet when I watched stuff on the television, when I watched shows on the television, the way they presented reality or life, it was always upbeat or positive or funny or quirky or dramatic. So you see, the point I want to get to is that for someone who had been brought up on a diet of television, I kind of believed that the world was way more interesting, way more dramatic, and, just way more profound than it actually was. And I want to say this: you are often influenced by people on the TV. You learn your behavior from people on the TV. I mean, I tell you what a classic trope is in television comedy. Classic trope is that there's a funny guy who always makes jokes and everyone thinks he's funny. So he's always got like a sarcastic one-liner, which everyone laughs at. You get this, just think of some rubbish sitcom like Friends. Someone like, is it Joey or Chandler? They'll always make quips and everyone thinks it's hilarious and the audience thinks it's hilarious. Well, one thing you see which people do is, and I certainly did this when I was 17, I thought if I sat around with other people and constantly made quips, they'd find me hilarious and adorable. The reality is they think you're fucking annoying and they tell you to shut the fuck up. And that's a classic case of the dissonance between how reality is portrayed on TV and how reality is actually, in real life. And if your diet has been, nothing but normie television all your life, you might suddenly be shocked to find out that reality is nothing like that. The most effective thing I've always found in real life is to, if I'm with a group of people, don't say much, just be a good listener. And people sort of tend to like that. I tend to just keep myself to myself. But what am I saying? So I'm saying that age 17, I'd come to this profound realization that the reality I saw around me was really depressing. It was really miserable. All sorts of terrible things happen. And everything I saw on television just wasn't true. And this comes back, by the way, to the point of Don Quixote, which is a very profound point. Don Quixote was someone who read so much literature that he became convinced that the real world was like it is portrayed in literature. And that's why he goes outside to start, fighting windmills, or he goes outside to fight knights and to win, to save women who are in love with him. And the reason he thought reality was like this is because all of the romantic literature that he read was like that. And the profound point with Don Quixote is that intelligent people who read books, are in lots of ways more prone to delusion than anyone else, more prone to delusion than your average person. Because in Don Quixote, it is Sancho Panza, the humble peasant, who has to keep reminding his master Don Quixote about the realities of life. And Chekhov was a man who understood this to his bones. And the thing about Chekhov is that everything that we find in literature, whether it is drama, whether it is, intriguing plot lines or, great stories, all of this is just chucked away. It's all chucked away. And Chekhov mastered the art of telling the reader about reality. Everything is mundane. So if you read Chekhov, you will find, if you take, for example, The Party, in this book, in this, I guess it's a short story, the hosts who host the party don't even really want to host the party because they're not in the best of spirits, but they kind of do anyway because, I don't know, they promised they would, or they've got some kind of social obligation. And there's this lovely scene where some guests leave the party, and at that point, the hosts brighten up because the guests are fucking leaving, and feeling guilty that they're happy that the guests are going, they then engage them in, some irrelevant small talk. So it's like at the moment the guests are going, the hosts suddenly, pop into a great mood, feel guilty that is so, and so engage in, start becoming incredibly interested in their guests and asking them all sorts of interesting questions, which is just, small talk. This is what Chekhov does so well. He portrays the reality of life, which is often a total disaster, in which people, often just keep up appearances, whereas deep down they're, depressed or dispirited or not in the best of moods. He just gets at the whole horror of reality. And so by reading Chekhov, I really got a grounding in what reality was like. And so that every time I came across things like that, I mean, for example, sometimes when I was very young, you'd get invited, someone would enthusiastically invite you to a party. And inside you think, I don't want to go. But then you think, I better go because they're trying to convince me. So then you go, but they're not that nice to you. And then you come away feeling depressed. And I guess ultimately you realize they only invited you because they thought you wanted to go. They thought you were shy, a bit of a loner. So out of politeness, they invited you, but they didn't really want you to go. So when you actually got there, they didn't talk to you. It's all this kind of shizzle. By the way, I don't want to make out that other people are horrible or have been horrible to me. There's plenty of times in life where I've been horrible to other people. There's plenty of times in life where people invited me to parties, and they probably meant it in the kindest and most sincere way possible, and I just said no. I said no, or I was rude to them somehow. I don't want to make this. I don't want people to think that I'm trying to say, oh, other people are so bad. and I needed that, this is reality. No, just as equally, and Chekhov is also great as this, Chekhov reminds you as well, the reader, that you're full of, you do loads of bad things. So when I'm talking about reality here, I don't want you to just think, this is not, I'm getting bogged down here. I'm a bad person who's done lots of bad things. I mean, equally, there's other bad people out there, and I've been on the wrong end of their badness. But what I'm trying to say is that reality is always, reality is something which people need to know about. And it is authors like Chekhov who really do the best job of telling us about reality. So that's why we need to know about reality. Because if you don't, I guess at 17, having had a diet of TV, I went round thinking that I was the main character in some drama, like Don Quixote. And I suddenly realized, fucking hell, this is wrong. You need to understand reality. And Chekhov gave me that grounding. So when 25 years later, I read Zola, I'm kind of thinking, I know all of this. And that brings us to the issue of what is the point of realism in literature? Well, I think I've just told you the point. The point is to give you a grounding in what real life is actually like. But honestly, once you've got that grounding, do we really need to know any more about reality? And this gets me to the problem I've got with Zola's L'Assommoir. Because as I say, it's a brilliant portrayal of what life is actually like. But having read all of Chekhov, do I really need to know this? Do I really need to know this? Because ultimately now I'm just thinking, I know all of this and it's not that interesting, which is I think I'm quite bad to say all of that, because Zola's a very clever guy. Let me just say, I've read 2 books by Zola before when I was, in my 20s. One was called Teresa Requiem, I think, which was okay, but not brilliant. But in the end, I said to myself, this was probably one of Zola's early works. He's not quite on his A game here. The second book by Zola that I read was Germinal, which is really brilliant. It's about a mining community in France. Now, when I read it age 20, this was what I said age 20. I said, the first half of Germinal is so brilliant because it just so accurately describes this mining community and the working classes in France. It just describes them so well, so good. The second part of Germinal, I said when I was 20, was way too melodramatic, because having set up this very realistic existence in the mining community, in the second half of the novel, a bunch of things happen which are a bit melodramatic, unrealistic. That's what I said when I was 20. What I will say today, age 45, about Germinal is that it's just a great novel. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing Germinal correct. Who cares? I don't know. But what I would say today, age 45, is that Germinal is simply a masterpiece. The 20-year-old in me was bothered that the second part of it was not realistic enough, because I was so obsessed with realism back then. The 45-year-old that I am today simply says, no, the second part, okay, maybe it's unrealistic that all those dramatic events occurred, but so what? It was interesting. It made the book very interesting. So that's what I'd say about Germinal. A very, very good book. What I'd say about L'Assommoir is that it is just purely realistic. There's no drama at the end, or at least I'm at 90%, and there hasn't really been any drama yet. So I don't think it's going to have a, dramatic ending like Germinal does. But anyway, so that's my criticism of Zola. My criticism of Zola's L'Assommoir is that I've already read Chekhov. That's my criticism, which is probably unfair, but I think there's something true in that. Because, again, to repeat the point that I want to say, once you've read enough realistic literature and got a grounding in what reality is like, I'm not sure the appetite remains to read a lot more. And here's one thing I will say about Zola's L'Assommoir. If Chekhov had have written Zola's L'Assommoir, he would have done one of two things. Either he would have kept it really short to about maybe 40 pages, like, for example, if you check out the story In the Hollow or In the Ravine by Chekhov, it is a very Zola-esque short story, which is very, very good, very, very good, exceptionally good. One of Chekhov's best, if not his best. But also it captures all of the kind of realism that you will see in L'Assommoir. You will find it in the Ravine. So if Chekhov had have written L'Assommoir, he would have kept the size down. Or if he was to make it longer, what he would have done was he would have introduced a character who the reader might be able to relate to. And this is where I get annoyed with Zola, because we're meant to be taking an interest in all of these characters who are interesting, yes, but ultimately the intelligent reader is not going to be able to relate to any of them. But it seems to me, from the 3 Zola books I've read, that he doesn't put anything of himself ever into his novels. And although some people will say, well, that's very clever, that's the scientific method, I presume this is what Zola would say. He is just, Zola said he was just like a chemist, putting chemicals in a test tube, shaking it up and observing what happened. And so Zola, I think, would say, I'm not meant to be in the novel. I'm the author. I'm just observing reality. In some ways, I respect that viewpoint, but in other ways, I don't, because as an intelligent reader, as all readers are intelligent, are we not entitled to have someone in the novel that we can truly relate to? Now, to come back to Chekhov, sorry. Let me just get a drink of water. To come back to Chekhov, what I want to say is that if we look at all of his novellas or extended short stories, in virtually all of these, you get a main central character who is intelligent, whilst, a lot of the people around him are not. And this intelligent character asks the question, what's the point of life? What's the purpose of life? How am I meant to live? I think that's certainly true in My Life, a Provincial Story. I think it's true in A Boring Story. I think it's true in Ward 6, An Anonymous Story, and also, is it 3 Years? So I think it's true in those 5. And I think it's very possibly true in The Duel as well. It's certainly not true in The Steppe, but The Steppe is not what, that was an early story by Chekhov and not one of his best. But the point I'm trying to say is that the reason Chekhov is so good is that he is the consummate describer of reality, and he keeps it brief. And if he doesn't keep it brief, he introduces a character who is intelligent and who is asking questions, what's the point of life? How is a man supposed to live? So I think that's probably all that I wanted to say about Zola's L'Assommoir. I mean, I think in my head at least, there are 4 major realist writers: Chekhov, Tolstoy, Zola, and Maupassant. And very possibly I've sort of said them in reverse order. Reverse order in which they came. Because I'll tell you, what I often thought about Chekhov, I often thought that Chekhov, when he was growing up, he read Tolstoy and to some extent enjoyed Tolstoy, and then eventually thought, I can do this a lot better. But I'm not sure that's true, because I see, up until like last year, I had never read Maupassant. And now that I've read Maupassant, who, I was surprised how good Maupassant was. And I'm also, if you read Maupassant, it's very hard not to think, oh my God, Chekhov just copied his entire routine from Maupassant. Now, whether that's true, I don't know. The internet didn't give me any, obvious answers. Maupassant certainly predates Chekhov, but whether all of Maupassant was translated into Russian when Chekhov was, growing up or, alive, I don't quite know. Let me say something about Tolstoy, because of all those four that I named, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Zola, and Maupassant, Tolstoy is ultimately the one that I least like. Because, as I've said before, in War and Peace and in Anna Karenina, there is a character. It's the same character. I think he's called Pierre in War and Peace. Okay, in the first book of War and Peace, which, by the way, if you're not going to, the first book of War and Peace is brilliant. After that, ugh. But the first book is brilliant, and in the first book, Pierre asks the question, how is a man supposed to live? He is our typical intelligent character who I look for in a novel, who is asking the question, oh my God, reality is so screwed up. How are we supposed to live life? That was Pierre in book 1 of War and Peace. 1,400 pages later, he's learned absolutely nothing. And then he turns up in Anna Karenina, again asking the same questions, and 800 pages later, he's learned nothing. So it took Tolstoy 22,000 pages to learn nothing. No wisdom whatsoever. That's the problem with Tolstoy. Tolstoy has zero wisdom. He asked the right question about how to live life, but he has no wisdom. As I said before, if you just read an early book like Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, that's a great Tolstoy book. As is the first book of War and Peace, book 1. But otherwise, not big fan of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And Tolstoy's later stuff is utter drivel. So that's Tolstoy. I've told you what I thought of Chekhov. I've told you what I thought of Zola. So let's come to Maupassant, because this is, I don't know why. Maupassant was one of those writers who, not only had I not read him, he wasn't even like on my radar. I mean, okay, I sort of vaguely knew who he was, but it was never the case that I was sort of looking at his books and half considering reading them. But ultimately, I read, is it La Belle Amie? Is it La Belle Amie or Le Belle Amie? I hate las and las in French. I don't know. It must be La Belle Amie. I don't know. I don't care. I hate la and la. But anyway, I read the Belle Amie. Let's call it the Belle Amie. And what did I think of this book? Very, very well observed. Very, very well observed. I mean, I'm going on about how well observed L'Assommoir is, but I think at the time that I read the Belle Amie, I even thought that was that was even better. Or maybe not. Maybe that's unfair. No, let's just say that Zola's L'Assommoir and Maupassant in the Belle Amie, in both cases, their observations of reality are just brilliant. And that's what I'd say about the Belle Amie. Okay, but let me just make one slight criticism of the Belle Amie is that it was too long. I read it on a Kindle. I thought it was a novella. And eventually I was sort of saying to myself, this novella is going on a bit long. I looked later on and it was 410 pages. So it was probably a bit long. And as I've said before, if you are going to write realistic stories, I think you should keep them brief or introduce a character that the reader can deeply relate to. Neither of those things were true here. But anyway, so that's one minor issue I had with the Belle Amie. Let me tell you about another issue I had with the Belle Amie. Because in this book by Maupassant, there is a central character who is the Bel Ami. Pardon my ignorance here. I guess it's he was, he's a man and he was handsome. So I guess is what, I guess the title translates as the beautiful man. But you know what? I'm guessing there's all sorts of connotations if we try to describe it. So, but the point is, the main character is a sort of handsome man. And at the beginning, I sort of felt a bit sorry for him. Then as time went on, I started to think, are you the architect of your own problems? But here's the important point that I want to get to. And maybe this is just because I'd never read Maupassant before. But what I didn't know until very late in the novel was what does Maupassant think of his main character? Because I really didn't know that. And I was beginning to think that maybe Maupassant thought he was like a hero. Or maybe Maupassant is just an idiot who doesn't even realize that his main character is kind of a bit annoying. And it was only very, very close to the end that Maupassant said something about the Bel Ami, which made me understand that Maupassant actually, on some level despised this character and thought him fucking annoying and, just a bit of a slime ball. But what I'm saying is it was only very, very later on that when Maupassant said something about this main character that I was like, phew, okay, Maupassant doesn't like this character either. And why? So why did this situation arise? This situation arises because Maupassant refuses to comment on any of his characters. It's almost like he will only describe what they're doing without comment. And I'm guessing that he and lots of other people will say that's the genius of Maupassant, that he lets the reader make their own mind up. But personally, in this instance, never having read Maupassant before, I was confused because I kind of, in some ways, I wanted to punch Maupassant and say, for fuck's sake, do you think this character's, interesting or, in some way a hero or someone we should be like, someone that we should like? Now, of course, I think if I had have read Maupassant before, I wouldn't have been in that situation. But I dare say that this is a certain problem that realistic authors have, especially the ones who want to sort of let the reader make their own mind up about characters. Because I'm guessing, maybe this is wrong. You know what? Maybe I don't know enough about Maupassant, but I'm guessing that what Maupassant did not want to do was feel like an overbearing, didactic schoolmaster telling you what you must think. So I'm guessing his approach was to let the reader make their own mind up. But as I say, it left me confused because it wasn't clear whether I was meant to like or hate or despise this central character. I kind of needed Maupassant to tell me that. Or I kind of needed Maupassant to just say something which made me, which tied in with the conclusions I'd come to. Anyway, I've blathered on about that. But very well observed book. And although I say it was long, and although I think it's longer than Zola's L'Assommoir, I still found that much easier to read than Zola's L'Assommoir. And then after that, I've also read some short stories by Maupassant. Let me just see if I can. These were very good because, as I say, brevity. If I will forgive anyone if they're brief, really. If you're brief as an author, I can forgive you so many of your sins. which, by the way, and I want to come to this. So yes, I think that brevity is so important. We're going to have a conversation about brevity. Actually, let me just leave that for a second. I really liked the first story, which was called The Moribund, it was a very short story just about two peasants, and I think one of them dies and they have to do the funeral. And it reminded me so much of Chekhov. There's a Chekhov story about a coffin maker who makes a coffin for his wife. And when I read this Maupassant story, The Moribund, I just thought to myself, this is where Chekhov maybe got a lot of his ideas from, or a lot of his influences from. That was good. The story of a farm girl was good. The Wreck was also good, which is about a guy who goes out to see a shipwreck near, I think it was near La Rochelle. So there was a lot I liked there. So that's Maupassant. But I will say, I haven't read all of Maupassant, and maybe I haven't read enough to make a judgment. I'm tempted to say that one major difference between Chekhov and Maupassant is that Maupassant doesn't. Chekhov is like a moral guide. That's what I'd say, and I suspect that Maupassant isn't. I suspect Maupassant has this kind of, I'm Maupassant. I'm just here to describe reality. Make your own conclusions. Got nothing to do with me. I'm off to go fishing. Make your own decisions. I suspect that is Maupassant's philosophy. Could be drastically wrong, because, like I say, I've read The Bel Ami, and I've read one collection of short stories under the general title of The Diamond Necklace. So I could be wrong, but my sense is that, oh, by the way, the story about going up in the hot air balloon, that was really good as well. Just because, well, I don't know, just because it's interesting to see people go up in a hot air balloon. But what I want to say is that my feeling with Maupassant is that he's kind of very cynical, and he's like, that's reality. And now I'm going off fishing, or now I'm going off to a restaurant. Make your own decisions. Whereas I definitely think that Chekhov is ultimately, however much he might deny this, he's a spiritual guide, in the same way that Tolstoy wanted to be a spiritual guide. So just to be clear, my feeling with Tolstoy is that, or a positive about Tolstoy is that he did want to be a spiritual guide. Unfortunately, he wasn't, because he didn't have wisdom. Whereas Chekhov was that spiritual guide, and he did have that wisdom. Zola and Maupassant, unlike Tolstoy, definitely had wisdom. They had bags of wisdom, I think. But Zola doesn't offer any personal. He doesn't offer any spiritual guidance, and he doesn't offer any personal involvement. He will not. It's like he just pretends, that we readers who are reading his books, it's like he pretends that we don't need to. It's like he doesn't offer any kind of personal involvement of any character. There's no characters in the Zola novels I've read. There were no characters who were like a bit of a version of Zola himself, an intelligent character who the reader can really relate to. So for me, Zola is missing something. He's missing any sort of personal involvement in his stories, which some of you will say is the sign of a great author. I disagree. And Maupassant, I think something similar is true with Maupassant. He's not that spiritual guide, and he's not maybe offering a lot of personal. He's not giving you much personal information. Some of you will say, but Chekhov never offers much personal information. But he does. He does. I think he really does. True, Chekhov doesn't give himself in his novels in the way someone like D.H. Lawrence does. I mean, D.H. Lawrence totally gives himself over in so many novels. You know, if you want to, you know, look at, you know, if you want to psychologically investigate D.H. Lawrence and all his struggles and problems with life, if you want to, you know, surgically, what's the word I'm looking for? If you want to surgically anatomize D.H. Lawrence's corpse, if you want to take it to bits and do an autopsy on it, you can, because he just totally, D.H. Lawrence bleeds and sweats into his own novels. Now, Chekhov does not do that, but I still think Chekhov gives himself ultimately. He gives something of himself. Whereas I feel with Zola and Maupassant, well, definitely with Zola, he doesn't give any of himself into his novels. He really doesn't. He doesn't give any of himself. And I think that's annoying. And I suspect something's true of Maupassant. But you know, I haven't read all of Zola, not by a long chalk, and I certainly haven't read all of Maupassant. So maybe I should shut up there. So let me just talk about a few other French authors that I read this year, or in the past 2 years. Very disappointed with Madame Bovary by Flaubert. Maybe I could have forgiven it if it was shorter. You know, it went on 500 pages or something like that. By the way, this is a problem, because in modernity, when we've got like the internet and Twitter, no one's got an attention span whatsoever. Of course, when the Victorian era writers were writing, what they were often doing, you know, when they were writing, people were like desperate to read anything. You know, I think people used to get like weekly magazines in which novels were serialized. You know, and probably you read this week's edition of the serial, and you know, after an hour you were like, holy shit, I've got to wait an entire week to get the next installment. Oh my god, what am I going to do with my life? You know, and then you had to go off to church, or you know, go and walk up a hill in order to entertain yourself. It's not like that today. But the point is that this fostered, I believe, this culture where, you know, where Dickensian authors would, you know, write forever and ever and ever. Amen. So that a lot of the Victorian novels, they're just too fucking long. You know, I'm not a fan of the long novel. A lot of the Victorian novels are just too long. And it makes it very, very difficult to read. I started reading Vanity Fair. I loved some of the early descriptions. I thought it was really funny and, you know, very well observed. But after about 100 pages, I just gave up and I just can't be bothered. You know, I just couldn't be bothered. It's too long. But actually, I want to say I'm a fan of brevity, right? And I would love to actually change the size of the average novel, because in today's culture, or in recent culture, it was always considered that a novel should be like at least virtually, well, you know, getting towards 200 pages long, 250, 300, with probably 400 pages being like an average size of a novel. Certainly in publishing circles, they always said a novel, I think, must be more than 50,000 words, which is about 166 pages. But a few things to say. First of all, I will repeat, I think brevity, given we're living in the internet age, is an important thing. And second of all, in this day and age, it doesn't really matter what the publishing industry thinks, because we're not living, you know, we're living in a Kindle digital age. So actually, stories can be as long or as short as they need to be. And I'm specifically talking about stories, you know, yeah, like I say, literary agents and publishers might say, oh, you've got to have 50,000 words. What's wrong with a 30,000 page novel in this era of Kindle and digital, you know, digital publishing? The answer is, I don't think anything is wrong with that. So the point I'm trying to get across is that if someone was good at writing short novels, I think they could flourish in this society, and there's no pressure for them to write longer. And in lots of ways, given that we're in this, you know, internet era where everyone's got an attention span of 2 seconds, in lots of ways, you'd think these sorts of stories might prosper, which is why recently this year, when I've been writing my own novels, I have been very, very keen to keep them brief. And yet, despite that, I've really failed. I mean, one of the last novels that I wrote, I really thought it was going to be 50,000 words. It ended up being, what, 88,000, 89,000 words. So almost twice as long as I'd anticipated, and I had no ability to keep it down. And I was kind of annoyed on some level that it got out of hand. But then again, I always think if you try to write short and end up writing more than you should, that's actually a sign that you're doing well. Some of you will say, no, that's a sign you're doing bad. I disagree. I think it's a sign that you're, you know, if you've got more to say than what the word limit is, I think that's a good sign. I think a bad sign is when you've got less to say than what the word limit should be, and you sort of have to invent some stuff to get up to the word limit. But anyway, but I will say I am a great breaker of my own rules, because the number of times in the last 2 years I've said to myself, for God's sake, would you keep it brief? The number of times I've said that in the last 2 years about certain authors, and then when I write my own fucking books, they're all running into like 300-page territory, which is not that long, is it? But I've sort of got a mandate to keep things brief. I'm hoping to write novels which might just be 150 pages, and yet I'm breaking my own rules and going on forever, which makes me a hypocrite. I want to talk more about my own novels later on. Let's move on. Moliere. Oh, okay. First of all, Moliere. I read some plays when I was in my 20s, and this year I read another one, which I think is called, what's it called? The Bohemian Gentleman. Is that the right word? Is it The Bohemian Gentleman? I can't. It's about, ultimately, it's about, is it about a man called Mr. Jourdain? Is that what he's called? Who is, you know, he's sort of quite rich, although I don't think he's an aristocrat. I think he's like a businessman. So he's a rich businessman who wants to sort of appear more cultured than he is. And so he takes lessons for this, but he can't really be taught. But anyway, I don't want to talk too much about the story because I don't even remember it that much. But the first thing I want to say is, oh my God, if you do brevity, and Moliere does brevity in his plays, because all plays are brief. And by the way, all plays are easy to read because it's just talking. If you do that, you're going to get big marks in the first place. And the second thing I will say is Moliere is just he's a great observer of reality, but he's also fucking funny as well. He has that theatrical comedy, what's the word? You know, how to describe this? He just has that great theatrical comedic way of making, the way he makes his characters talk and the way they interact. It's just innately funny, but it's hard to describe. You know, I'm not going to be able to do it justice. You know, it's not like a sitcom where, you know, a bunch of events are contrived, which are funny. Rather, it's funny because of the way the characters talk and the way they interact. You know what? It was last year that I read this, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice by describing all of this. But what I love about Moliere, whenever I've read his plays, I guess I read The Imaginary Invalid and The Misanthrope and one Tartuffe the Imposter when I was young, is that you instantly get into them he immediately starts, and it's immediately interesting and just funny. But when I say funny, this is what I'm having tricky describing. It's funny in the sense it just, that Moliere is a clever person who is aware of, he's observed human life enough, and he can see, how silly people are at times, and how, caught up in their own bubbles they are at times. And he knows the absurdity of two characters who are kind of different and on different wavelengths trying to sort of interact. I'm not going to do it justice, but the one thing I will say is I will definitely come back to read more Moliere. In fact, I hope to read all of his plays because he's worth it. And like I say, first of all, the plays are brief, so they're very easy to get into and very easy to finish. But also, he is a great understander of human beings. And he just has this comedy style, which I like. Who else then? What was the other? There was another Frenchman on the list. Oh, Balzac. I've talked so much about Zola, and I'm probably not going to say so much about Balzac, so that you might think I'm a big fan of Zola and I don't think much of Balzac. But honestly, Balzac is one of the authors who I have found in the last 2 years who hitherto I'd never read and wasn't much aware of. But he is one of those authors who is like a new author for me, who I've come across where I thought, I really love this guy. I really, really, really love this guy. I started by reading the novella Colonel Chabaret, something like that, and I absolutely loved it. Again, it was novella, so it was very brief, but just it was one of those books where I'd read the first 10 pages in about 10 minutes, because Balzac is just such a good raconteur that he in some ways he reminded me of what I think Dickens should be. I haven't really read much Dickens in my adult life, but I like to think of Dickens as a great storyteller, a great raconteur. But that said, I sort of think I'm a bit of a snob and think Dickens is a bit beneath me. Maybe that's justified, maybe it's not. I don't know. But Balzac, there's something about Balzac which is like, at the beginning of a novel, he's like, I hope you're sitting comfortably, get a nice cup of tea, settle down in the bath. I'm about to tell you a big story. That's what I like about Balzac. But also, okay, on the realism, is Balzac realistic? Maybe compared to Zola and Maupassant, he's probably less realistic, but honestly, I still think Balzac's very realistic. I likened him to Dickens a bit before, but I don't think Dickens is realistic. Balzac, I think, is massively realistic. And also his observations of human beings are just brilliant. Again, totally on the, totally up there with Zola or Maupassant. His observations. But this is really important. Unlike Zola, unlike Maupassant, for whatever reason, when I read Balzac, I really feel like I'm warming to the guy. I'm really feeling like he's there to hold my hand and say, do you see how stupid all these characters are? And some of you will say, Thomas, that's lame. You shouldn't want the author to hold your hands and, to hold your hand through the novel and tell you which characters are irritating or stupid. But I think I kind of do want that. I want to know that Balzac's my comrade in arms, that he's my friend, that he's sitting there and sort of telling me isn't reality absurd. And really, that is what I love about Balzac. By the way, let me just mention, I've only read Colonel Chabert and The Black Sheep, which has got a complicated French name, which I won't try to pronounce. So I've only really read 2 novels, one of which was The Black Sheep. But what I feel with Balzac is that he speaks to me. He speaks to me from the 1840s or wherever it was. And I love the guy. I can't tell you how much I love Balzac. And I feel the opposite for Zola and very possibly for Maupassant. But I love Balzac. He's so warm in a way which I love, and I feel his life pain. I feel his life pain, and I love the fact that even though he was, around in the 1840s or whenever, that almost 200 years he can talk to me, and I know him intimately, and I feel his life pain. So for me, Balzac, as well as being just a brilliant observer of the human condition, as Zola or Maupassant, with Balzac, I feel there's a warmness there. I feel his life pain, and I feel like I connect to him. And that I can't stress how important that is for me. I love Balzac. I love the guy, and I love the writer. But the other thing I want to say about Balzac, so this was in The Black Sheep. We get a dramatic ending in The Black Sheep. So the rules of, because let me say this. In Maupassant's The Bel Ami, there is a duel where 2 gentlemen decide to have a fight. And how does it end? In the same kind of anti-dramatic way that it might do in reality, in that, and this is quite funny. The Bel Ami is a total coward and doesn't want to fight the duel. Very, very realistic. This is just so realistic. The Bel Ami does not want to fight the duel. He does not want to fight the duel, but he has to go anyway because he has to keep up appearances. I think his seconds in the duel, the gentlemen who are arranging the duel for him or whatever, I think they think that he does want the duel, but secretly he doesn't because he's a total fucking coward. And then when he has the duel, I think they just fire past each other, and the Bel Ami thinks he's going to die, but actually he's fine. And then everyone thinks he's a hero, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm a hero." Very, very realistically done. Actually, interesting. Chekhov in The Duel also does something similar, where it's like, there's a very realistic duel. But in Balzac's The Black Sheep, no, we get the dramatic. We get the dramatic, and that involves someone getting shot in a duel. So one of the protagonists in the story is shot in a duel. That's The Black Sheep. That's Balzac. So whilst Balzac is great at describing reality, his book would not be described as pure realism. You wouldn't describe The Black Sheep as a purely realistic novel because it's got dramatic elements. But this is maybe what I want to come to, because it gets back to what I was saying, which is that I think I want drama in a novel. I think I want dramatic things to occur. Why would I not want dramatic things to occur? Because I know about reality. I read Chekhov when I was 19 and 20. I know enough about reality. I've read enough realistic authors that I don't want reality. I want drama. If there's going to be a duel, make someone die. Let there be action. Let there be drama. Although, to be clear, I like the way that both Chekhov and Maupassant handled their duels. We need to know reality. So I'm glad that Maupassant and Chekhov told us the reality of duels. Some of you might be saying, what the fuck is a duel? Well, you'll just have to, Google it. But the point is, once I've read Chekhov's narrative about a duel, and once I've read Maupassant's narrative about a duel, I think I just want to go back to having duels be entertaining. And this is the point that I want to get to. This is the point that I want to get to, which is, Literature at one time, if we go back far enough, was all about entertainment. And gradually over the years, it probably started to get more refined. And authors who were more concerned with realism started writing books which, although they were still dramatic and tragic, were getting more and more realistic. And then when Tolstoy and Chekhov and Maupassant and Zola come along, they make an art form out of showing us pure realism. But in my opinion, that was just an inflection point, because after those four and some others have showed us what realism is, do we need it anymore? Isn't it, in fact, isn't there just going to be a trend away from realism? Because, as I say, once you've read enough realistic novels, you won't want to read any more. There's a limit to how interesting realism is. And once you know what realism is, it's almost like you want to go back to tragedy and drama and novels simply being creative. And now, see, as much as I was a big fan of Chekhov in my 20s, and in my late teens, and as much as I was always interested, as much as I've got that grounding in reality, I almost now feel totally opposed to the concept of realism, because, first of all, it negates the great creative impulse to come up with something, to use your imagination. Surely writing literature should be about using your fucking imagination, because it's almost absurd to we have to live in reality. So why not, when you're writing a book, create something better than reality to help us escape reality? That's what I think. We want something which is better than reality. And if you've got an imagination, you should use that. You should use that imagination to come up with something creative, to take the reader on some great journey which lets them escape reality. So that's what I think about that. So that's maybe a good place to bring me on to Ruth Rendell. Ruth Rendell, Barbara Vine. I've read a couple. I've only read 2.5 of her books in the last 2 years or whatever, but I've rekindled my love affair with Ruth Rendell, or Barbara Vine. She's got 2 pen names. Okay. So I'm saying, just to go back to the point, after we've had all these realistic authors in the 1870s, 1880s, whenever it was, my point was we don't need any more, and we need to get back to being tragic, dramatic, creative. And I just think that Barbara Vine, Ruth Rendell fits that bill. Because, let's ask this question. Just by the way, if you don't know who Barbara Vine or Ruth Rendell is, she's ultimately a crime writer. She's a crime writer. I'm going to say a bit more about crime shortly, but she's a crime writer, and in that sense, her novels are not realistic. They immediately fail the Chekhov realism test. They immediately fail that, because they're all about fantastical things like murder, or getting away with murder, or, crimes of one nature or another. So Ruth Rendell's novels are the antithesis of the Chekhovian motif of, representing in fiction the mundanity of life. But they're entertaining, they're interesting, but also they are so creative. And that's the first thing I want to say about Ruth Rendell. Her novels are so creative, and some of the ideas she has, I think to myself, what a brilliant idea. I would have never come up with that. What a brilliant idea. So that alone, as a sort of testament to the ingenuity of the human mind, is now something which I totally appreciate in literature. I like to think, oh, wow, that's a really great creative idea. But also, and this is the other thing I want to say, in a funny kind of way, Ruth Rendell is very realistic. But this, I try to think for hours and hours about describing this, and I'm still not sure how to describe it. But what I want to say about Ruth Rendell's crime novels is I want to give them I want to invent the name of a genre which describes the sort of books that Ruth Rendell writes. And I came up with, I came up with loads of ideas, but two which I like are therapeutic realism or, therapeutic realism or realistic therapy. What do I even mean by that? Let me just pick a Ruth Rendell book, which I read a long time ago, which is called Make Death Love Me. And let me just briefly describe this book as I remember it. So, spoiler alert, if you don't want any spoilers, you don't want to listen to the next part. But anyway, there's a man who works in a bank. He's a bit dissatisfied with his life, with his marriage, with his job, I guess. But he works in a bank. And, well, let me ask you this. Let me say this. Bank robbers going into a bank to steal the money, that's quite a good plot line. On the other hand, the bank manager doing an inside job and taking money from the bank, quite an interesting plot idea. But what happens in this book is something, it's just a great idea, because what happens is the bank manager, he likes to put the money from the bank in his pocket and to walk around with it in his pocket during his lunch break. Why? He just gets a kick out of it. He likes, he likes to get a big wad of cash out of the bank, put it in his pocket and walk around in it in his lunch hour just for kicks, just to get a thrill out of it. Anyway, when he's doing this one lunchtime, the bank gets robbed. And what then happens is that, so the bank gets robbed, the robbers go away, and this bank manager realizes that he can essentially steal the money that he had in his pocket. He doesn't have to put it back as he normally would, because all the money from the what's it called? For fuck's sake, all the money in the bank, in the vault, has been taken. So he doesn't, the money that he always puts in his pocket during lunch hour just for kicks, he doesn't have to put it back. And actually, I think the other people at the bank get kidnapped. So our bank manager has got the chance to flee and pretend he was kidnapped as well. Or the police and his family will think that he got kidnapped as well. Whereas in reality, that's not what's happened. He's just ran off from his life as a bank manager with the wad of money he's got in his pocket. I probably haven't explained that well enough, but do you see what a great conceit for a novel that is? We've got a man who's unhappy with his life as a bank manager. He's unhappy with his family life. For kicks, he puts a bit of cash, a wad of cash from the bank in his pocket during lunch hour. One day the bank gets robbed. All the money gets taken, and the bank staff are taken hostage. And he realizes this is his chance to flee his boring life as a bank manager. The police and his family will think he's dead, so he can sort of go on the run, and he's got a bit of cash in his pocket as well. I just think when I was saying before that a novel should not be about reality, it should be testament to the human creative spirit and the ingenuity of the human mind. This is what I mean. Because to repeat, this guy could have just said, oh, why don't I steal money from the bank? But that wouldn't have been interesting. That wouldn't have been interesting. It's the fact that fate conspires to reveal to him that he has this chance to escape his mundane life as a bank manager and with his family, with his wife. And that, as I say, great creative idea. And also it's something which I like to call a conceit. A conceit, what do I mean by a conceit? I mean an idea which is totally contrived, which would never happen in reality, but which somehow gives us like some great new insight or great perspective, and somehow lets us see the world through a different lens. You won't get any conceits in Chekhov. I mean, the nearest you'll get to a conceit, I hope that word works, in Chekhov is in an anonymous story where a spy goes undercover to work in an aristocrat's house. And it's a conceit because the story isn't about spying. It's about bringing together an aristocratic character and a more working class character so that they can have a conversation, and so that the working class person can spy on the aristocrat's lifestyle. That, I guess is that a conceit? Is that the right word? You know what I mean, though. But in general, you don't get any conceits in Chekhov's books. And even that one was not really, it was a very minor conceit. But with Ruth Rendell, you get these totally contrived, ridiculously contrived ideas or scenarios, which nevertheless, they somehow give you this great insight into the world. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that in this Ruth Rendell novel, what happens to the guy who has the chance to flee the bank? Well, he ends up meeting a woman, and they sort of fall in love. This woman is really on his level. But guess what? In the end, it all goes wrong. And it all goes wrong. The bank manager dies, I think, and the woman that he fell in love with just thinks that he sort of, that he stood her up. So she's left with a bad opinion of him in the end. So what's the point? The point I'm trying to get to is that although things happen in a Ruth Rendell novel which are contrived and unrealistic, it's almost like at the end of the day, nothing good comes of it. It's almost like at the end of the day, we are reminded with a big punch in the face what reality is like. There's another Ruth Rendell novel in which a guy wins the lottery. It's called The Lake of Darkness. He wins the lottery and he's a good person, so he just wants to give the money away to good causes. And all sorts of problems ensue. And, very bad things happen in the end. I won't give away the plot spoilers. But do you see how in that novel, what Ruth Rendell is doing is she's contriving a situation that would never happen, like winning the lottery. Look, people just generally don't win the lottery. And if they do, most people don't think about giving it away. This guy, I think, was willing to give away all the money he'd won to good causes. I don't think he wanted to keep anything for himself. So it's a totally contrived scenario. It's never going to happen. It's not realism. Chekhov would be having a heart attack. It's not realism. He wouldn't really be having a heart attack, just to be clear. But it's anti-Chekhovian. It's anti-realism. A man wins the lottery and then wants to give it all to charity. And yet, there isn't a happy ending. In fact, there's the opposite of a happy ending. It all goes wrong. And it goes wrong in a way which is realistic. It goes wrong in a way which is just so realistic. So do you see the problems I'm having in trying to explain to you what we even mean by realism. Because as absurd as it is to call Ruth Rendell realistic, in some ways she's so realistic about human nature, and that's the cornerstone of her novels. So yeah, and this is why I call it therapeutic realism. And what I'd say is it's like Ruth Rendell. She knows about reality in the same way that Chekhov does. That's the first thing. The second thing, however, is that she knows that literature should be, a great kick at misery, to quote D.H. Lawrence. She knows that literature should be about doing something creative which sort of rises above the mundane level of the human condition. That's the second thing. But then in the third thing, it's like whatever happens in her novels, at the end of the day, it's always brought back to this pessimistic, realistic interpretation of life and the misery of life. Some of you might have a problem with me equating pessimism and realism. That's a conversation for another day. But often, yes, realism is often very pessimistic. But what I'm trying to say is that I trust Ruth Rendell, that she knows about reality, but that she's decided to be creative and to rise above the mundaneness of the human condition. Yet, despite that, in the final analysis, she will always bring her novels back to the hard, miserable, pessimistic reality of life. Now, I don't know that Ruth Rendell read Chekhov. I don't know that she was. Well, I don't know for sure that she was grounded in reality, but I feel that she was. See the difference? Yeah. Someone might say, well, all authors who write in the fantasy genre understand that reality sucks. They're all grounded in reality. They all understand that reality sucks, but they write fantasy novels as a great kick against reality in order to kick reality in the teeth and present something more which rises above the miserable human condition. But I'm not sure that's true. I mean, just take Star Trek, for example, which I watched as a teenager. I'm very sure that a lot of the writers on Star Trek who are fantasy writers didn't have a good understanding of reality, and that they weren't just saying, yeah, we know all about Chekhov, but it doesn't need to be done again. Instead, let's write some nice fiction about this spaceship in deep space. No, I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. But what I'm trying to describe is very, very difficult. But let's take D.H. Lawrence, because as you know, I'm a huge fan of D.H. Lawrence. And I think D.H. Lawrence totally fits into this category. He understands reality. He's grounded in reality. But then he says, if I'm going to write a book, it should be this great creative totem to the greatness of the human spirit, in order to get away from the miserable, mundane stupidity of real life. But then the third point is that in D.H. Lawrence's novels, we are always brought back to reality somehow. We're brought back to reality, not because everything goes wrong, but because reality is always there to bite at you. I feel like I often thought that authors like D.H. Lawrence are post-realistic. Because by the way, nothing much happens in a D.H. Lawrence novel. It's not like there's any. I mean, certainly, compared to Ruth Rendell, where there's a load of murders and crime and this, that, and the other, there's nothing like that in a D.H. Lawrence novel. Nothing. So it's very realistic in that sense. But often, well, first of all, in any D.H. Lawrence novel, there's always a character, an intelligent character who you can relate to, who is, and we see the world through their eyes. So this is the antithesis of what I was just describing with Zola. This is why I love D.H. Lawrence and why I feel cold towards Zola. Because D.H. Lawrence will always, every single time in every one of his novels, there will be at least one character that you can relate to, that the reader can relate to. One character who sees the misery and the realism of the world around them, but who wants to rise above it somehow and go on some great journey. And that is the spirit of D.H. Lawrence. You know, to take someone who is suffering in the ordinary world and is sick of reality and to try and somehow make them escape to a better world, which often involves going off to foreign countries and traveling. And maybe, you know, like, you know, in one book, the female character goes off to live with American Indians. But that said, usually at the end of the novel, there is some kind of kickback from reality. There's some kind of, you know, we're chained to reality. As much as we might want to fly off at, you know, and ascend and get to something greater, it's not possible. There's a load of problems. It's not quite possible. So that's what I'd say about D.H. Lawrence. I'm very confident. Oh, I know for certain that D.H. Lawrence had read Chekhov, for example, and he'd probably read you know, he certainly read Tolstoy, and probably, I should imagine, Maupassant and Zola. But D.H. Lawrence is obviously grounded in reality. But I'd call him post-reality because he aspires to something great in his novels. He aspires to take intelligent characters and take them on some great journey. And often, you know, that journey might somehow fail in the final analysis. But, you know, and that's when reality bites. But nevertheless, they try to make the effort. They try to make the effort to fly higher than the mundane reality they were surrounded by. Let me just say something about Thomas Hardy. And this, by the way, this is where my thesis runs into all sorts of problems, because you see, Thomas Hardy, who is probably a contemporary of the likes of Maupassant and Tolstoy and Zola, and I guess Chekhov as well, Thomas Hardy would not be described as realistic. In lots of ways, he's melodrama. So if we wanted to be unfair to Hardy, and I don't, we might say, you know, he's not realistic. But you know what? This is in some ways, I feel like Thomas Hardy was post-realism. if I can use this stupid idea, because what I'm saying is, okay, in Thomas Hardy, it feels to me that Thomas Hardy is a guy who knew what reality was, and that in his novels are attempt to be creative in some way, so to give us some wonderful story which takes us away from the mundanity of the real world. So he has that creative impulse, and yet in the final analysis, reality drags people down. But I say reality because ultimately in any Hardy novel, it is the tragedy which pulls people down. And tragedy is sort of like a dramatic version of reality. I mean, I don't want to pick, I couldn't think, it's a long time since I've read Hardy. I couldn't think of a good example, but let me just invent an example of the kind of thing you'll see in a Hardy novel. A man falls in love with a woman. The woman falls in love with a man. The woman hopes that the man will come and ask for her hand in marriage. So the man goes out to meet the woman and asks for her hand in marriage. But along the way, he sees someone drowning in quicksand, goes over to help this person drowning in quicksand, ends up drowning in quicksand himself. And for whatever reasons, everyone in the village, instead of looking for him and realizing that he drowned in quicksand, just presumes that he went off somewhere else. And the woman who was hoping to be asked to be married, she also thinks this as well. So the woman is left sort of stood up by this man, thinking that he just went away because he wasn't interested. We, as the reader, know the reality, which was that he was very interested. He wanted to marry her. He loved her, but he's died in quicksand. Now, none of that is realistic. It's not realistic in the slightest way. I can guarantee you that scenario literally never happens. What it is, however, is this: it's very creative. It's very brilliant in a creative sense. So it's like the story lifts us up. The story lifts us up. It elevates us from the misery of the human condition. That's one thing. But the second thing is that in the end, it sort of parallels the reality of life, the mundanity of life, the misery of life. In the sense, so it's like a tragic representation of reality. It's therapeutic realism. It's therapeutic realism because it's if you know about reality, we've all been stood up, we've all faced conditions of unrequited love, and we've all been in scenarios where maybe you had a crush on someone, but the fates decided that person went here and you went there, so you didn't end up being together and you moved apart. So we know all of this stuff from reality. We know all of this stuff from reality. And what Thomas Hardy does is he takes that and converts it or transforms it into a tragedy, which is both deeply entertaining and also somehow therapeutic. So, as I say, it's like therapeutic realism. And by the way, this is exactly what Ruth Rendell does. What Ruth Rendell does is she takes a load of real things and converts them into tragic things or dramatic things, and it kind of acts like a therapy. But you see, if this is true, we can certainly describe Ruth Rendell as being post-realism because she was post-Chekhov, Tolstoy, Zola, Maupassant, etc. But we can't describe Hardy as being post-realism. But surely Hardy understood what reality was. Surely he understood the mundanity of life, as Chekhov did. But he chose to write tragedy because it's a great kick at misery. And it's therapeutic realism. So what I'm saying is, in this botched, inchoate thesis that I've got is, we can talk about pre-realism, realism, and post-realism. But what's really the difference between post-realism and pre-realism? And how do we ever know which authors did actually understand reality but chose not to write about reality, chose to be dramatic, chose to be tragic because they knew that was better therapy? So this whole thesis is it just doesn't work. I mean, if we go back far enough, are we really saying that Shakespeare didn't know about reality? A great writer like Shakespeare, did he not know about reality? Would he have been surprised by Chekhov's work? I don't think so. But I presume that Shakespeare, knowing about reality, said, yeah, well, we don't want to write about that. I'd rather write tragedy, or, I'd rather make things dramatic. There's loads still I've got to do. Let me just say something more about Ruth Rendell, because I watched some Ruth Rendell episodes. They were TV dramatizations. I'm not a big fan of doing that. I usually prefer to read books, but it is what it is. There's one called May and June, which I think is just brilliant. And it's about May and June are two sisters. And we all know about sibling rivalry and how ultimately tragic and distasteful it is, because you love your siblings, but there's also such a thing as sibling rivalry. Now, if Ruth Rendell was Chekhov, she might have just told us in straightforward terms about sibling rivalry. But Ruth Rendell is not Chekhov. She's Ruth Rendell. So instead, what she does is she wrote a story which I watched as the TV adaptation, which plays on the idea of sibling rivalry, but it takes it to heightened levels. I'm going to give you some spoiler alerts. So, I'm just telling you that because I need to give you the spoilers so that you understand my point. Because in this story of sibling rivalry, one girl literally steals, let's just say she steals the husband of the other sister. So one sister steals her sister's husband. And then later on, the sister who was cheated on, she kills her sister in return. Now, actually, when I describe it there, it doesn't sound that interesting. So what am I saying? But what I want to say is, in real life, it's quite rare that one sister will take her sister's man or husband. I suppose it happens, but I think it's quite rare. It's very rare that one sister would kill another sister. So Ruth Rendell, in her story, May and June, is not being realistic. She's not being realistic at all. But she's giving us like a heightened reality. She's giving us a heightened reality, which is therapeutic. It's therapeutic because if you know anything about sibling rivalry, it's kind of like a tension that you might have experienced. And so by watching the Ruth Rendell adaptation, we get therapy for that tension inside of us. It helps us. So this is why I call it therapeutic realism. But if Ruth Rendell was a bad writer and she wrote badly and one sister killed another and one sister stole her sister's husband, if she was a bad writer, we might just think, yeah, so what? Not interesting. So I think the issue is that you have to be able to ground things in reality somehow. So even if what you're writing about is not realistic in the Chekhovian sense, you somehow have to ground it in reality, because if you don't do that, the viewer or the reader will not be able to relate. That's what I think. So as much as we might say Ruth Rendell is not realistic, if she wasn't a realistic portrayer of characters and real life, we wouldn't be able to connect to the story, or the story would not seem as potent as, it would not seem as potent as it should be. It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to describe what I'm saying, but I think what I'm saying is, if there's fantasy here and reality here, probably most good novels have to be a balance, because if you're too fantastic, nothing makes sense. I mean, if I write a story about a man who dies and then comes back to life again 3 days later or something, it's a stupid story, because it's gone beyond there has to be a certain level of realism to a story, because if there's too much fantasy, you just can't relate to it. If just a bunch of fantastical things happen, I mean, look, if I write a story about two people on a planet at the other end of a galaxy who can't die and don't need to eat and don't know what love is, I mean, so what? Yeah, no one's going to be interested in that story. Every story has to be anchored in reality to some extent. It has to be. But then again, if it's totally anchored in reality, if it's a story is just realism, probably in the long run, we're just going to get very bored by it. I hope you understand the problem, the issue that I'm talking about. I feel like at one and the same time, it would be stupid to call Ruth Rendell a realistic author. But on the other hand, it is her realism which is the cornerstone of her greatness. What else did I want to say? Let me just... By the way, the other thing we watched the other day was a TV adaptation of The Fatal Inversion, which is a book by Barbara Vine that I've never read, but I love the TV adaptation. Again, unrealistic, but sort of quite realistic. Therapeutic realism, I don't know. I mean, let me just say something about Dostoevsky's The Double. Dostoevsky wrote The Double, which is, by the way, I'm not a big fan of Dostoevsky, as you know, but possibly The Double is his best book. It's about a man who meets another man who is basically, he looks the same as him, and maybe they've got the same character. So it's a story about a man who meets his twin. And the reason that I mention it here is that that's not realistic. I've never come across anyone who is nearly my twin, and most people never meet anyone who is nearly their twin. And yet this guy literally meets another man who is his twin. Totally unrealistic, totally contrived. But it's a conceit. It's one of those great creative conceits, which in the first place is interesting, but in the second place, it allows us to see life through a certain lens. And ultimately, with The Double, you can say, oh, that's not realistic. But it's getting at some deeper truth, because how this man reacts to another man who is like identical to him, this tells us so much about human nature. So that's another thing I might say, which is that, and this might be true of Ruth Rendell as well, which is that even if in the first place you don't even if in the first place you're completely unrealistic, sometimes by being completely unrealistic and putting characters into imaginary scenarios that would never happen in real life and which are totally contrived, sometimes at the end of all that, you end up telling deeper truths. You end up telling the reader some deep and profound truth which they might have not got otherwise. So, do you see how complicated this business is? I've said a lot. Let me just go through my notes. I think I've done a lot, but let me just say a few other things. Let me just get a quick drink, sorry. Let me say this. Another author that I've come across in these past 2 years, like Balzac, where I thought, oh, this guy's good, is Nabokov. Nabokov is not an author that I read when I was in my 20s. As you know, in my teens and 20s, I read a lot of Russian literature from the 19th century. I read a Nabokov book recently, or 2 years ago. Very, very good. Nabokov's a sensational author. Sensational. And I would definitely put him in the highest rank of Russian authors, alongside Chekhov, alongside Turgenev, alongside Lermontov. Nabokov is up there with those Russian greats, 100%. I say that having only read one of his books, but he is very, very good. Very, very interesting character besides, because in so many ways, he's like a linchpin. Well, is linchpin the right way? He's like a linchpin between old Russia, the Russia of Chekhov, the Russia of Tolstoy, the Russia of Turgenev. He's a linchpin between that Russia and the modern Russia. Do I mean that? Or the modern world? Because if you don't know, Nabokov was a Russian aristocrat who ultimately had to flee Russia, and I guess eventually he ended up in America as well as Paris, I think, and Europe as well. But he was very much an aristocrat in the Tolstoyan sense. Like Tolstoy, did Tolstoy grow up partially in France? Probably not. But Tolstoy, Tolstoy grew up as an aristocrat with French tutors. And Nabokov, I believe, grew up, even living in France half the time. He's very, not just bilingual, probably trilingual, very clever guy. So Nabokov in himself is just an interesting guy, but very good writer. The only thing I will say is this guy Nabokov took issue. He's a very opinionated guy, deserves to be an opinionated guy, but I'm afraid he had a pot shot at both T.H. Lawrence and Turgenev, which makes me want to dig up his fucking corpse or his fucking skeleton and fucking hammer it to death and put his descendants into a gulag. That's how fucking incensed I was when I saw what Nabokov was saying about D.H. Lawrence. Suggesting that D.H. Lawrence wasn't even a good author. I mean, please. And he had similar to say about Turgenev. I mean, I haven't read all of Turgenev, but fucking hell, if you've read Fathers and Sons, or A Sportsman's Notebook, well, that's enough to make Turgenev a brilliant author. So, wasn't very happy with that. Like I say, his descendants belong in a gulag. Other than that, though, what a great guy. What a great author Nabokov is. By the way, I also read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Now, some of you might know that I praised Shakespeare earlier, didn't I? But honestly, I don't have a great relationship with Shakespeare because I think the language is just antiquated. It's funny because a contemporary of Shakespeare, or roughly a contemporary, was Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. Now, Don Quixote was an easy book to read, but of course, I read a modern translation of it. So that makes me think that if I had have read, if Cervantes had have been English and I'd read the original Don Quixote as it was written in English, I may have not understood any of it. You won't get an answer from anybody on this, or if you ask if you ask a lot of people about this, they'll just say, "Oh, Shakespeare's brilliant." But I'd like to know, is Shakespeare difficult to read because the language is antiquated, or because I'm just not clever enough to understand Shakespeare? It must be because the language is antiquated, right? Shakespeare, by the way, the way to read Shakespeare is you read it like riding a bike. If you ride a bike fast enough, you'll go. If you ride a bike and you go too slowly, you'll fall off. And that's kind of like what you've got to do with Shakespeare. Just read it quickly. Because if you suddenly think, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. I'm going to try and decode that and work out what that means. You'll never get going. You've kind of just got to go with what did the word mean when it went into your, when the word went into your head first time, what was your immediate reaction? What was your instinctual reaction? I'm saying that I don't follow my own advice either, though. That's why I've got troubles with Shakespeare. But Julius Caesar, I will say, it wasn't so difficult to the point where I could gallop through the pages quite well. I mean, I still had problems with it and understanding what it was saying sometimes, but it wasn't like some Shakespeare I've read where I thought, oh, for fuck's sake, what does this mean? It's like reading a foreign language. No, I got through it quite quickly. Let me say something about Greek literature. Well, that sounds more grandiose than it is, but I read the Odyssey. And I also read a couple of Greek plays, The Trojan Women, and is it called Oedipus? I think it is. It's the guy who finds out that his father... No, he finds out that his wife is his mother. Spoiler alert. What do I want to say? Look, the Odyssey, okay, it was a bit too long. It was a bit too long, but in general, it was a good story and I liked it. Maybe just a bit too long. That was what I said to myself after, when I was reading it and after I'd read it. Great story. Great story. I shouldn't whinge about it being too long, but I don't want to say, oh, you should read the Odyssey. It's just so great. When you might be sitting there thinking, oh, for fuck's sake, get on with it. in the modern age, it's a long book. That was my first thoughts about the Odyssey. But later I found out that when it was written in verse. And that in fact, it's really like a song or a poem, which people used to sort of recite. Some singer or performer would go to the Greek theater, is it, and sort of sing this long song. But I loved it as, it was translated into prose. I should be clear about that. And so what's my point? My point is, by the way, I hate epic verse. I detest epic verse. I started to read a bit of Virgil. What's it called? The story about Rome, which was also epic verse. Gave up very quickly, didn't like it. But I hate epic verse. I loathe epic verse. I can't do it. And yet I found that the Odyssey actually was in epic verse originally. So when I say I've read the Odyssey, I mean I've read a modern prose translation. Does that count? It makes me think. It makes me think that there's a limit to how much, there's a limit to how much I can actually learn from what was said at that time. It makes me think that all works of literature have a shelf life. Maybe that's wrong. But I do wonder, because if that had have been an epic verse, there's no way I would have read the Odyssey. And I didn't know it at the time. I just casually picked it up and thought it was written like that. But also, I mean, there's other things which are hard to connect to, in the Odyssey, because it was kind of like a fantasy novel today where there's gods and goddesses and they direct characters, etc., which perhaps we don't really have an understanding of today. As for the two plays, read The Trojan Women. The Trojan Women was difficult to read at times. I didn't understand, like Shakespeare, difficult to read at times. And also, it probably wasn't that great a story. And that was said in the introduction, in fact. So I was glad I had makes it sound like I read introductions. I don't read introductions to books. But I did sort of notice that at the beginning of the introduction, the person doing the introduction said it's not the best of stories. And I don't think it was. I might have a very, very negative opinion about The Trojan Women, because I don't think it was, the storyline wasn't great. And it was also just difficult to read at times, inscrutable at times. But that said, the one thing which I must praise The Trojan Women for is that you get a totally great feeling of the atmosphere, of the mood. You really can transport yourself back and feel as if you are on, is it an island in Greece, and amongst the Trojan women as they have been captured during a war and are about to be sold into slavery as chattels. You totally get this. That is the great aspects. That makes me pleased that I read this play. It's short as well, so that's helpful. But that makes me so pleased that I did read that play, because before I'd read this story, I was full of hope that it would be a great story, because it's just such an interesting topic of these women being caught in war and sold into slavery. And if the story was disappointing, the atmosphere and the mood was not. You can totally transport yourself back to being with these Trojan women. That's the thing. You can really feel, you can sense it. It's so upsetting and tragic. It does really take you back and gives you a flavor of ancient times. I also read Oedipus, which again, this was not inscrutable. That was the great thing. This was totally legible. It was totally legible. I didn't struggle to read it. Also very brief, as all plays are. And also, I think, a great story. I mean, it's not, it doesn't quite feel like the modern European literature, but my God, it was so close enough to that. So with Oedipius, it was not difficult to read, and I think it's a really great story. I mean, that said, it's not quite, it doesn't have the mood and the ambience that the Trojan woman has, the Trojan women has. In some ways, Oedipius is a bit contrived and silly in a way that the Trojan woman was not. The Trojan woman there's something so bleak and deep and tragic about that. But anyway, I'm definitely going to read more Greek plays, because plays are easy to read and they're short. I don't think I would read like Homer's The Iliad, however, because it's probably just going to be too long. And then there's the epic verse issue. But anyway, who cares? I also read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde this year. Good news about that is it's very brief. That's a massive plus point. What I will say, however, I don't think it's probably not quite my cup of tea. It's bordering on sort of sci-fi, and it's not. By the way, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that wasn't quite as metaphorical as I'd understood. But I will come back to it. It's a brief book. And therefore I'm so happy I read it. The brevity. The brevity counts so much in its favor. Now, another book I read was Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe. I don't remember what's the author's name, but let's just call it Robinson Crusoe. I can't remember who wrote it. Okay, with this, it's too long, and that really gets fucking annoying after a while. It's just too long. That said, in its heart, it's a very well told story, and I did like it. I did like it a lot. If only it could have been a third of the size. It felt too long, but I loved the storyline. I loved the central character. I loved this book in a way I didn't love Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I'm going to give a thumbs up to, because it was brief. Whereas I really loved Robinson Crusoe. I loved the heart of the story, but it went on too long. I also read George Orwell's 1984. George Orwell was an author who I came across when I was 16. I read Animal Farm, and also, some of those short stories where he's a waiter in Paris. But ultimately, see, I thought Animal Farm was clever when I was 16, but by the time I was 17, I thought it was trash. I thought it was not very clever. I thought it was shallow. And thereafter, I didn't think much about George Orwell. When I got on to, reading Chekhov and D.H. Lawrence and Turgenev and Lermontov and, the Bronte sisters, etc., I think I always looked down on George Orwell, which I feel terrible for now, because when I got red-pilled, in 2013, I suddenly realized that what George Orwell had been talking about political-wise was ridiculously on the money. Ridiculously on the money. And also, George Orwell is one of those famous people or authors whose quotes are just always bang on. Same, by the way, is true for Sol Jensen. I'm losing my voice here. Hang on. The same, by the way, is true for the Russian version of George Orwell, Sol Jensen. The Russian dissident. Quotes are brilliant, and George Orwell's quotes are brilliant. And often, if I look at the authors that I like D.H. Lawrence or Chekhov or Turgenev or whoever, they often don't have brilliant quotes, but George Orwell always does. So anyway, I got round to reading 1984 with a renewed love of George Orwell, given how prophetic his vision was, and given that he was he's left us with a very important warning. That said, when I read the book, maybe I was reminded. I don't like saying this though. I don't like saying it. But the book was a bit difficult to read at times. And maybe I was reminded that literary-wise, George Orwell isn't perfect, let's say like that. I don't want to be disparaging, because I think the guy, he did so much. But politics-wise, and this is featured in his novel, I mean, he's just so ridiculously on the ball. There were so many passages I was underlying, and I don't underline passages, but there were so many passages where he just hit the nail on the head and perfectly described the political reality that we are living in these days. And I just thought, my God, this is just so on the money. So I don't want, all I'm saying was I found the book a little bit difficult to, it was a bit long, and it was all tell and not show. But I don't want to be critical of George Orwell, in a literary sense, because what he tells you in a political sense, the amount of political wisdom in there, you will not find in any other book. And this comes back to what I've been saying for a long time, is that as much as I love D.H. Lawrence or Chekhov or Turgenev or Lermontov or Fenimore Cooper, how the hell would they ever help us to navigate the time period in which we're living in? Whereas if you want something to navigate, it would be 1984. And if you want a man to help navigate you, it would be George Orwell. And so that is why, I've just got so much respect for George Orwell. And that is why, in this book, the political insights, the prophetic view of the life we would be leading in the future, it is so unbelievably true. And it is so reassuring to have 1984 and George Orwell as a companion to help you navigate these tricky times. But anyway, I'm going to very much wrap this up very, very soon. But let me just say, I just want to talk briefly about myself, because I've gone back after the hiatus of a scientific project, which I've been doing for the last 5 years. I finally kind of got sick of that on some level, or I realized it's going to take ages to finish. So, the original idea when I started the scientific project was that it would be wrapped up in a year, and then I'd go back to writing literature novels. 5 years into it, it's nowhere near to being wrapped up. But I kind of got sick and tired. And this year I had the brainstorm of idea of maybe writing a novel just to cheer myself up. And then I've ended up writing about, I guess, is it 8 at this point? And by God, look, let me just it's not really humble bragging. It's just outright bragging. Although my detractors will say, ha, 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 you're a rubbish writer. Ha, ha, you're writing rubbish. If you were good, you would be published. Ha, ha, ha. But anyway, my detractors will scoff. But, I am so lucky to be able to write at the minimum 9,000 words a day. But honestly, sometimes it's been like 12,000. And there's one day when it was 15,000. But I'm just regularly churning out. I'm banging out novels, to quote a Ruth Rendell character. I'm regularly, churning out. I'm writing at a ridiculous pace, and I've sort of written 8.5 books this year, I think. But anyway, what I want to say is, what am I writing in? Because, like I say, realism, Chekhov was my first love. It was of necessity my first love. I was not interested. This is what's interesting. I didn't really read books when I was a kid. I watched TV like everyone. And the only reason I got into Chekhov really was because he told me about reality. And I wasn't particularly interested in reading novels. But Chekhov got me into novels because he showed me that literature could be, well, it just got that by telling me about reality, which is what I wanted. I ended up reading novels or stories, And after Chekhov, I thought, well, Chekhov liked Tolstoy, so I'll read Tolstoy. And from there, it just sort of burgeoned, however you pronounce that. So I was very much realism when I was a 19-year-old, 20-year-old, 21-year-old. But now, as I say to you, I'm not really interested in writing realism. I have actually written some realistic short stories, but not that many. And I soon gave up on that genre, apart from the fact it's never going to be commercial. But not even just that. I don't think my heart was perfectly in it. So what do I write? Well, recently, every single novel I've written has been a crime novel in which things happen that would never happen in real life. So what's the fascination with crime? Well, as I say, it's like therapeutic realism, I think. This is what I'm talking about with Ruth Rendell. First of all, you can come up with conceits which are very creative and which take the reader away from the miserable mundanity of reality. But then second of all, you can then pivot back to realism in this kind of therapeutic way. So I would like to think that what I'm writing is therapeutic realism. And actually, I really want to say this is so important. If I try to write realism today, there would be something false about that. Whereas writing these crime stories, I'm somehow telling you about my true self. Because if I was writing realism today, like a Zola or a Chekhov, it would all suggest that I'm like a respected author, that I'm respected in society. So, dear readership, here's my latest book. I've observed this. I've gone amongst the working classes and observed that this is how they behave. The point is, in today's society, I'm a complete loser, and that matters. I'm a complete loser. I'm a complete nobody. Nobody likes me. Look, I don't have any position in society. So for me to sort of sit there in a cold and indifferent way and say, oh yeah, reality's like this. No, I've observed realities like this. That's not real. There'd be something disingenuous about me sort of describing reality as if I'm like a neutral observer who is sort of, one of the elect writers in the way, because ultimately, whatever you want to say about the lack of success that Zola or Tolstoy or Chekhov or Maupassant had, maybe in some ways they struggled for a bit. I don't think any of those guys struggled for that long, really. Even maybe in the case of Tolstoy, never struggled. All of these men very quickly rose up the ranks and became respected authors, respected people in their communities. And with that comes a certain... One second. That is so disgusting. That is so disgusting. But I tell you, when you talk for 2 hours straight like that, you start to sort of cough up spit. It's quite disgusting. You don't want to know about that. Well, what I'm saying is Zola, Chekhov, and Tolstoy and Maupassant, and in some ways they were like pillars of the community, respectable people. And also, if you've got a readership and you've got respect, you can sort of turn up for your latest story as a pillar of the community and sort of say, well, I've observed this and I've observed that. And you can sort of be polite, and you can sort of be, what's the word? You can sort of help people through your novels. I don't know what I'm talking about, but The point is, I'm a total loser in today's world. I've got no status whatsoever. People don't even know I'm a writer. No one cares what I say. And we are living in such a profoundly fucked up world that I think it's way more truer for me to write fucking crime novels in which bad things happen, which express my intrinsic anger at the world, my rage at the world, and which totally trounce all over the fucking rules of, you know, the civilization or polite society. Because it would be absurd. It would be absurd for me to sit there like a Zola or a Chekhov and to say, "Oh, this is reality," and "Oh, this is," and "Oh, and when that's not. I'm a raging fucking bastard who is you know, is right to be upset. Is right to be upset that I've sort of, you know, that society doesn't really recognize my talents. I mean, let me tell you about the book I just wrote, which was about a guy. He ends up being blackmailed by this family, and he has to give them money. They blackmail him. You know, they have him on a sex tape, and they can easily give it to the people he works with. So he's blackmailed and he's blackmailed and he's blackmailed. And then eventually he snaps and gets into an argument with one of the blackmailers, which turns into a fight. And he eventually kills one of the blackmailers. But then it's not just enough to kill one of the blackmailers. He has to kill all of them. And indeed, they're a family. So they're a family of blackmailers. They're not a very nice family. But then again, they're not totally evil either. And he sort of was friends with them at the beginning. But he doesn't have any other choice but to kill every single one of these blackmailers, everyone in the family. And he has to do it in some quite atrocious ways because he has to not leave any evidence, because if he leaves evidence, the police will catch him and he'll be arrested. The story is called How Man Fell Out with God. But the point is, there is something in that story which is so much truer than if I was to write about realism. I mean, look, one of the realistic stories that I wrote when I was younger was about a woman who loses her job, and when she loses her job, she realizes that she's sort of outside of society. And she sort of goes downhill, and she realizes she doesn't have many friends, and she starts, you know, she becomes lonely, a bit insane, goes on the internet and says some things, and is desperate to get a job back, so tries to get a job back, but doesn't. But then in the end, she's sort of nearly arrested, but isn't. And the moral of the story is, or the moral of the ending of the story is, ooh, thank God I didn't get arrested, you know, for saying something bad on Twitter. Now that I was lucky enough to escape that, I'm just going to keep my head down, and I'm going to, you know, get on with my life somehow. Which was a nice story at the time, but I don't believe in that spirit anymore. Because I mean, why that woman shouldn't have been arrested for, you know, saying something on Twitter, and she should be cared for. She shouldn't. If she loses her job, she should be given help to find another job. But more than that, there should be people in the community who care about her. So why would I write that story anymore? And if I was to write that story anymore, what would happen is the woman would turn into a criminal, because maybe she would actually be arrested for what she said on Twitter. And then she'd go to prison or something. And in prison, she'd harden up and she'd come out even worse. And when she came out, she'd get revenge on all the people who had bothered to send her to prison in the first place. And for, you know, creating this hellish world that we're all living in. So that's what I'd write the story about today. In some ways, I think I'm very, very biased now. And I don't have that neutrality, which maybe a Chekhov or a Zola would have. But at the same time, I feel like it's more true for me to not have that neutrality, to sort of say, I've got skin in the game, to sort of say, I'm very passionate and angry. I mean, again, the story that I've got coming up, there's a story I'm going to write coming up, which was, it was about a woman who falls out of love with men because she can't find a husband, and she gets really upset. She's sort of a bit shy and a Jane Eyre type figure. But she really falls out of love with men, and then she swears to get revenge on all men, and then she does some things and she partners up with somebody, and they go around getting revenge on men. But in the final analysis, she realizes she goes too far, and also she happens to meet a really nice man, and they fall in love and live happily ever after. That's a story that I'm about to write. And I conceived of that idea maybe 10 years ago. Was it 10 years ago? Something like that. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago. But guess what? Now that I'm about to write it, I've completely changed the ending. Because, okay, so she's gonna lose all, the main character is gonna lose all faith in men, decide to get revenge on men and go out after them. Then we'll have the happy ending where she realizes she's gone too far and ends up marrying the husband. But there's a horrible twist at the end of it, whereby her past catches up with her. She's wrongly convicted for a crime which her friend did, but she didn't do. So, okay, her partner in crime did this horrible crime, which she was witness to, but she didn't do it. And yet our main character is going to go to prison for that. And her husband's going to turn on her, and her best friend will turn on her, and her mother's going to turn on her. And then when she gets out of prison, she's fucking demented. She's demented like a witch. And she just goes about getting revenge on people and doing, doing some horrible things. But honestly, at this point in time, that seems more true to me. And more, it's more of my true self, even though that's quite fantastical. It's quite a fantastical plot. It's not realistic. And also it's kind of biased. It's biased in the sense that I would have been more neutral in the past and more able to see things from different people's perspectives. But now I'm just with this character, this lonely woman who is ultimately betrayed by society, ends up betrayed by her friends, ends up in prison and goes demented. So, but anyway, the one thing I will say is, because fucking hell, since 2020, I've been very, very depressed and miserable. Because I hit 40 and I still hadn't made it in any of the things that I wanted to make it, like literature. And then, of course, the political scene just went sour from 2020 onwards, and I've never recovered from that. And, of course, learning everything I've learned in the past few years about what my fate is to be, and the coming humiliation, the coming, infamy in front of the entire fucking world, and I'm going to suffer, where everyone's going to think I'm nuts and evil and disgusting, etc., etc., and then I'm going to be killed as a mob cheers. Obviously, all of this has put me in a very negative frame of mind. But that said, it's so true. It's so unbelievably true. Was it Nietzsche who said it? But when you suffer all this misery, somewhere at the end of the rainbow, there will come a bout of insane creativity, so that I've happily, finished 9 books this year or something like that. But anyway, and I've got ideas for a lot more, which I'm hopefully going to finish soon. But listen, I'm going to wrap up very shortly. Let me just look at my notes. Where the hell's my pen? I can't find my effing pen. That's irritating. Yep. Just briefly, let me just say a few words on crime, because crime certainly falls, I think, into our camp of therapeutic realism or realistic therapy. I really do. But I also think that the reason that crime fiction has taken off in the last century or so, I believe, is because we live in a fallen world. That's one thing. We live in a fallen world where there often isn't justice, so that people feel like being vigilantes, but because in reality they can't be vigilantes, they want to fantasize about crime in their heads, and in tandem with that, they want to read about crime. So it's thwarted vigilantism, which leads to a thirst for crime novels. That's one thing. On the other hand, however, the world in which we live is incredibly tense. It's incredibly tense and incredibly stressful. And people have to be very polite and keep polite veneers up all the time. And so secretly, I think they go away and, they're in some ways, people in today's world are repressed criminals. And so they go away and want to read crime novels to fantasize about things that they can't do in polite society. That's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it, I think, is this. And that is that we are in a pre-war scenario, because World War III is coming. And it won't just be a war in a classical sense. It's going to be civil conflict. It's going to be neighbor against neighbor. It's going to be, local person against local person. It's going to be civil conflict on the streets of the entire world. I think that's what's coming. And the point is, where we are in we're in a pre-war scenario, and those of us who've got good future visions, I can explain all this using stream theory, but you don't want to know that. Those of us who can sort of, what this means is, when you're living ahead in the time before a civil conflict, there's more and more ability. People have more and more ability to imagine that civil conflict. They have more and more ability to imagine that civil conflict. And so they are anticipating being on the wrong end of crime, and they are also fantasizing about doing crime. And because of that, that finds expression in crime novels. So the reason that, when crime novels take off, this is a very bad sign that your society is in major decline. I will say that. Crime novels, the prosperity of crime novels is an indication that your civilization is about to collapse. And that is why we have this love affair with crime novels at this time. Which, by the way, incidentally, if we do get out of this hellhole, at the end of time, and we get into, I don't know, the millennial kingdom, it might be quite utopian. It might be quite paradisical. And if it is, people won't want to read crime novels. So I don't know who will want to read my novels in the future. I suspect if we end up fixing society and ushering in something like a utopia, people won't even care for crime novels anymore. They won't have that appetite anymore. So who the fuck am I writing all these novels for? But you know what? At this stage, I just don't know who I am writing for anyway. I don't. I hate to say it. I hate to say that I'm just writing for myself, but it feels like I am. I hate to say that I'm writing for myself, but it feels like I am. And also, I mean, I've sort of given up on people being able to understand all the nuances of books, because most people don't read books. And even of the people that read books, the literati, there's people with terrible tastes. There's people who read literature who've got terrible tastes, total midwits. But then even people who read classical literature, they often, like, if you look at their reviews, they often just praise the book as if they have no critical engagement with it. So honestly, I sometimes feel like the number of people anyway who could properly appreciate my books, that you could fit them on a postage stamp. But I don't even care. I'm kind of past caring at this moment in time. And also, I will tell you this. Once I realized I'm not going to get a publishing contract, and once I realized I'm going to die, I'm just like, fuck, I'll write whatever the hell I like. I don't know. See, this is what I'm going back to before, is that when Zola and Chekhov and Maupassant, when they become pillars of the community, they do have to sort of write within certain limits. They have to be respectable. I don't have to do any of those things. So in some ways, I'm very lucky as an author. It's peculiar, but it's true. I'm lucky as an author that no one wants to fucking read anything I've ever written, because it just sort of gives me the green light to do what the fuck I like. Someone will say, "Oh, yeah, well, you're rubbish anyway." So, but anyway, who fucking cares? But just one final point, because just on the issue of crime novels, you see, I enjoyed like TV crime series, like the Beale or Homicide, Life on the Street, or Oz. I enjoyed those crime series, or the Ruth Rendell TV adaptations. I enjoyed these crime series on the TV when I was a kid. Then when I got into literature, or when I was 18, I kind of had a bit of a I snootishly looked down on crime a bit and thought it wasn't as clever as Chekhov and D.H. Lawrence and Lermontov and Fenimore Cooper, Mark Twain, this kind of thing, Cervantes. But ultimately, as I've said, I've very much got back into crime novels, and because now the most important thing about a novel is that it's entertaining and it takes me on some journey away from reality. I've really gotten into crime novels quite big time. But what the one thing I think I was always wrong on is when I had this snootish sort of distinction between literature and crime novels. Because honestly, if you look at some of the greatest works of literature, I think, aren't they really just crime novels? I mean, I don't like Dostoevsky that much, but he's still a very good author. And all of his novels are crime novels. Crime and Punishment, The Idiot is essentially a crime novel. Brothers Karamazov, they're all crime novels. Also, Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time, which is one of my favorite books. I totally recommend it on every level. It's only 185 pages or something. Amazing novel, brilliant novel, oh, unbelievably good. Such a pity that Lermontov died when he was 35 or whatever. Amazing book. But I think it's definitely a crime novel. I would say it's a crime novel. And also, who else did I write down? Well, certainly Joseph Conrad, I think, is probably a crime novelist. I mean, something like The Secret Agent, is that a crime novel? I think so. Probably Nostromo is a crime novel. And I'm sure, some of the others as well. I can't think of them all offhand. But then in some ways, I mean, is Wuthering Heights a crime novel? It's probably going too far, but it's got that criminal aspect. And the same I would say is true of Balzac's The Black Sheep. It's not a crime novel per se. No, Balzac's The Black Sheep is not a crime novel, but there's a criminal element in it. Let's say that. But ultimately, here's the kicker, because isn't Shakespeare all crime? I mean, we think of Shakespeare as sort of the pinnacle of literature, but surely it's all fucking crime, right? If you think about Macbeth, it's like everyone's stabbing everybody. It's essentially, it's like, it's a den of thieves. And isn't that, I haven't read all of his plays, but certainly Julius Caesar. Is it Julius Caesar? Julio? No, it is Julius Caesar. Julio Cesar is the Inter Milan goalkeeper. Julius Caesar, is that ultimately a crime novel? Actually, on a side note, I kind of think that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare conspiracies are probably true, but more interesting than that, I think Francis Bacon might have been the Moshiach of his time, the Messiah of his time, the guy who ran the conspiracy. I think that must be true. And that there's hints in Julius Caesar that the author, Shakespeare, knows that more is going on than what is presented. As if there might be a hidden hand directing the events of Julius Caesar. But you know what? I'm not sure about that. because it's difficult to read. It's a difficult book to read, and I may have misread certain bits. I may have misread certain bits. I may have misread it. I mean, certainly Julius Caesar is about political intrigue, but I'm not. Maybe it's going too far to say that. Yeah, it is going too far. It's definitely going too far to say that there was a hidden hand at work there. But you do sometimes wonder when I read Julius Caesar, I did sometimes wonder where some of the characters are getting their motivations from, and didn't that might have been asked. You know what? I'm out of my depth talking about that, so I'm just going to stop there. I'm out of my depth. But anyway, listen, that's enough. I think I said everything I wanted to. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on literature. You know what? That was very therapeutic for me to say it. So I'm gonna end the stream now. So take care. Have a great Christmas or whatever it is. Oh my God. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. But hopefully that's not the end of the story. That's just Act 1. It's just Act 1, Scene 1. I'm the main character in my own little drama. But anyway, thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much for listening. Take care. Have a great Christmas. Enjoy the holidays. Happy Hanukkah. And ciao, ciao.